I've seen you talk a little bit about how long length partials or the stretched position impacts glute growth, and I've listened to Brett Contreras talk about this a little bit, the glute guy, and I heard him say he's generally in favor of the long length philosophy or idea for his upper body and stuff like that, but thinks that there might be something different for the glutes and maybe the lower body. Do you like have any takes on that? I know there was one study where it compared squats to hip thrusts directly, and there was no difference in glute growth. Where I guess technically compared to like the hamstring study by Mao and the tricep study, where using a more lengthened position from the start, not necessarily using lengthened partials, led to better outcomes. You would, I guess, in theory, expect the squat to do better. So I don't know what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say is that you're very clued in. Like, you've read your stuff. I've actually spoken to Brett about this before. Uh, I don't personally buy into it. I don't think that the glutes are special in some regard. The rationale, I think, for Brett stems from, and I don't want to speak for him, but I think this is what I've gathered from speaking with him, is that if you look at some data on internal leverages for different hip extensors, as you go from your hips being highly flexed to your hips being more extended, there's some evidence that the gluteus maximus, for example, has better leverage when your hips are nearly fully extended, whereas when your hips are more flexed, which is the lengthened position for the glutes, they have worse leverage internally than the adductor muscle, for example, the adductor magnus. And so, based on that, and your body generally probably trying to be somewhat efficient, at least in some maximal tasks, it may choose to recruit more so the adductor when it comes to hip extension in a lengthened position, but more so the glutes when it comes to hip extension in a shortened position. Now, I don't think that's a very compelling rationale, because when you're performing resistance training to failure, those differences in internal leverage play much less of a role, because your body has to recruit all muscle groups involved for that function. If you're doing to failure, by definition, you won't be able to produce enough force to overcome the resistance. And so your body will recruit all muscle groups responsible for that function, whether they have slightly worse internal leverage or slightly better internal leverage. In the case of the study you mentioned, comparing squats and hip thrusts, there's a few reasons why I do see it. And again, going back to the probabilistic thing, right? Just like studies support for a notion are probabilistic, their applicability to a given question is also on a spectrum from not being applicable whatsoever to being extremely controlled and internally valid in terms of looking at the question that you're trying to answer. In this case, I think it kind of falls in between the two, where it is comparing ultimately an exercise that places the glutes in a more lengthened position versus in a more shortened position, and an exercise like the squat in this case that is placing more tension in a lengthened position and less so in a shortened, versus the opposite in the case of a hip thrust. So there is that component. But we are ultimately, in contrast to many range of motion studies and muscle length studies, talking about two different exercises. And that does introduce some confounders. Like, for example, we are talking about a cohort of participants that were relatively untrained and that, when taking a set to failure, might be less inclined to take it to true failure when it comes to failing a squat versus failing a hip thrust. There's the idea also that the squat and hip thrust differ, that on the basis of the squat involves the quads. It involves other muscle groups like your lower back a little bit more. So it may just have been that those muscle groups reached failure first, right? And they're responsible for different muscle functions, and that thus the glutes didn't get a completely maximally effective stimulus compared to the hip thrust, where the glutes and adductors are going to be by far the primary movers. So that's kind of my thoughts on that study, and I think it's worth noting that when you look at the other study I mentioned earlier, where essentially they compared a full range of motion on the multi-hip machine to doing lengthened partials. So they were comparing, I think, 90 degrees of hip extension, so going from 90 degrees of hip flexion to just your hips being neutral, to doing just the bottom half of that movement, so going from 90 degrees of hip flexion to just 45 degrees of hip flexion, but they were never fully extending their hips. They saw more glute hypertrophy when doing the lengthened partial. And again, that study hasn't been published yet, so I'd take it with a slight grain of salt. But I think that just on the basis of its study's design, the fact that it's also within participant design, so you kind of wash away some of the noise associated with genetics, stress, sleep, PEDs, what have you. So it being within subject design, it using the same exercise, which washes away some of the confounding variables associated with using different exercises I just mentioned, I see it as stronger support. Um, so I don't personally think the glutes are anything unique in that sense.
Hey, if you like that, you can go check out my full conversation with Dr. Wolf once it's posted.